One important form of communication that we're going to be spending some time on in this class is professional presentations. There are 3 public presentations that you'll give in the course of this class, and you'll actually do a practice presentation for each of those. So my goal right now with this is to do a presentation on presentations. And the caveat I should start with is that us professors, when we give presentations in classes, are not particularly good models of professional presentations because we're often quite extemporaneous in what we do, because our goal is very much to connect with you as students and be present in that moment. While you do want to be present in the moment when you're presenting professionally, you also want to know exactly what you're going to say ahead of time and say what you're going to say. And that is particularly true of short professional presentations where every single word counts and you're usually sort of trying to be as concise as you possibly can be. So I'm not modeling the perfect example of the presentations you'll be giving in this class, but hopefully I'm giving you the information you'll need to give a good presentation. So I'm going to talk about 10 different things today. And the first of those is how presentations fit within the context of executing on projects. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general characteristics of a good presentation. I'm going to say a couple words about types of presentations. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to start a presentation in a way that grabs the attention of the audience, some tips on visual content, some tips on organization of content, talk a little bit about the nonverbal components of a presentation, a few tips on dynamics within a presentation, talk about some of the problems of presentations, and then finally I'll say a couple words about your upcoming presentations. So first of all, to just return to this, to the overall process of executing on a project, we've talked about the sort of circularity of the project process. And obviously, we've spent quite a bit of time now talking about proposals, and you're still in the midst of sort of working on your initial proposal, revising that proposal. But there are several stages of project management in which you might be giving public presentations. And one, in fact, is at the proposal stage. It's often the case that you will be presenting your ideas that you haven't yet executed on in a public way. But then, of course, there's a lot of other points after you've executed on a project. You're often reporting on the project. So there's a bunch of different contexts in which you'll give presentations. The particularities of presentations vary a little bit depending on what stage of the process you're in, but much of the information about what makes a good presentation is the same. And the general characteristics of good presentations are first and foremost that they're targeted towards a specific audience. So what you want to know as you prepare for a presentation is who your audience is, what they already know, what they don't yet know, what they already care about, and why they should care about the work you are engaging in. So you want to think about those very carefully as you build your presentation. And as with any form of communication, empathy is really important. As you work on your presentation, you want to consider your story through the eyes and ears of those who you're going to present it to. So as you create graphics, be thinking about how will my audience interpret these graphics? How will they interpret the way I'm conveying this information? But that's sort of critical. You want to develop content in your presentation that is professional, it looks good, it's useful to your target audience, it's understandable to them, it doesn't contain information they're not going to get, it's credible, and of course you want to tell an engaging story to your audience. And then this is the engagement part. You want a style that really engages, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as I go through here, but you want to think about the way in which you convey that information beyond just your verbal communication. So there are multiple different professional sort of formats for giving a presentation. And for a moment, I'm going to talk about sort of time limits. Sometimes when you're invited to give a talk to an audience, you have the better part of an hour to give that talk. This is particularly the case if you go to a professional meeting for the invited talks, or what are sometimes called plenary speaker presentations, where they have people give, longer talks. The most typical presentation length is 12 to 15-minute presentations, and I'm going to sort of talk about those in these classes, even though we're giving a variant of that, which is a shorter presentation, which sometimes people refer to as lightning presentation. So I'm going to say quite a bit about the 12 to 15-minute presentation, but most of that content is applicable to the shorter presentations. It's just you don't have as much time, and therefore you have less content for those. So your opening slide is actually pretty important because it's usually where you're going to provide context and information, and most importantly, it's when you're going to either capture your audience's attention or not. And you usually have about a minute to grab them. And thinking carefully, and I'll give you some ideas for openings a little bit later in this presentation, but it's very important to think about what you're going to say first and how that might grab your audience's attention. So you're opening with a title slide. It's going to have some imagery on it. That imagery is very important in conveying information. The title itself is very important. You want it to indicate either your intended outcome, which is true for a proposal presentation, or the actual outcome, which is true of a report. It's going to need to include the names of collaborators, and at some level, what you say during that first slide is going to need to convey why this work is important, who it's important to, and why your audience should care about it. Now, there's an optional thing that I've seen a number of people do very effectively, which is to have a second slide, which basically is the take-home points for your talk. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence in social psychology that telling people the take-home point right after you've introduced your talk is actually an effective way of getting them to remember that. It's not an approach that I actually ever take in talks, but I've seen it done quite effectively. And so I thought I would put that down here. Content slides. So after your title slide, you're going to have a series of content slides. The particular content slides are going to vary depending on what stage of the project you're at. But collectively, these are going to tell a clear and compelling story that describes the need for the work, the context in which the work is being conducted, the problem that the work is designed to solve, or the gap in knowledge. Obviously, this harkens back to the proposals that you've been working on. It's the same kind of content you want to be presenting here. You want to describe in these content slides what you've done or what you are doing or will do, what you found or plan to do, and what you've learned or intend to learn. So those are all part of the content slides within a presentation. And then, you're also going to want to wrap it with how others might use and build on what you've done. And then usually you have a closing slide that sort of wraps up the information. It communicates the big take-home points, the things you really want people to take with them. You want this to be simple and memorable so that they effectively take this information from you. And by the way, every photograph I'm using in this presentation is from presentations that were given by students in this class in previous years. So how do you create an opening that really engages people? Very important to think about this, and I want all of you to experiment with this in your presentation. So I expect all of you to use some sort of engaging opening. And here are some options for what you can do. Sometimes people will engage their audience by starting by asking some sort of a provocative question that your talk is going to answer to sort of get them thinking right at the start. Sometimes people start by citing some sort of impressive fact or statistic that relates to the work that's being presented. Sometimes they cite a provocative or summative quote. So they'll quote some important person that kind of frames the problem that you're going to address. Sometimes they relate it to a very recent news story. That's a great way of making it relevant to the moment. That the audience is going to be aware of. Occasionally, people do use humor. It's not usually recommended to do that because jokes fall differently with different audiences. So unless you really know your audience and know you're going to be able to pull this off, it's probably the least the least good idea to start with. On visual content. So this is actually an example of how one might use a statistic in the opening of a talk. So let's say I was giving a talk on that was really emphasizing the importance of environmental dashboard as a visual mechanism for communication. I might choose to start that talk, if that's the emphasis I wanted, by saying 75% of the information that people take in from the world around them is visual information. So that would be a good way of grabbing people's attention. Now, what I'm trying to do with this statistic, though, is to get you thinking about how important the visuals are in your presentation. Now, obviously, we think about an oral presentation. What you're saying is really crucial in that oral presentation, but it's important to keep in mind the powerful effect that the visuals you use, every aspect of the visuals, the background visuals, the visuals on the side, are having on what people are taking in. So in this particular slide, I'm using this image in the lower right-hand corner, which I wouldn't necessarily even need to say anything about. It's conveying this idea of the importance of considering all five senses. And it has visuals at the top to really emphasize the effect of those visuals. And I might not even need to say that because that visual is effectively conveying that without me needing to draw that out. But for you, important to think about how the visual elements of your slide presentation are reinforcing the oral content you present. The other senses tend to be a lot less important in professional presentations. Um, yeah. So you really want to carefully think about this combination of images and words and how they have this collective power. And when you think about images in particular, different images have different effects. Photographs do a great job of sort of contextualizing things. Conceptual models can be very useful for helping people understand things. And again, that little image on the right is an example of a very simple conceptual model of senses. Data visualizations, displays of graphics can be very important. Obviously, in several of your projects, the visuals are the graphical presentations are very important. So you're going to want to include them as sort of minimally as sort of examples of what you're trying to accomplish in your work. As much as possible, you want your visuals to be as simple as they possibly can be. So generally speaking, in a 12 to 15 minute presentation, you wouldn't want to include more than 3 data slides because otherwise you'll overwhelm people's capacity to take in information. And you always want to think about how can I simplify information as much as possible. And a good example of where people often get that wrong is by including too many digits. It takes your brain the same amount of memory power to store every digit in a number. So in the number 1.258, the 5/8 are actually probably pretty unimportant numbers in that. And so if you can simplify that, round that to 1.3, people are much more likely to remember it, just as saying, $29.83 is much more difficult for someone to remember that number than simply saying $30. So lots of examples of ways to sort of simplify information so that you're not asking too much of people's memory. Tips on organization. The first one is organize your talk. Think really clearly about creating a clear, logical, concise, and efficient flow of information in which different people in your group are not repeating the same information. Keep ideas and visuals as simple as they possibly can be. Use bullet points with a minimum of words on them. Don't use full sentences. Sequentially reveal slide content to match the narrative. You can see I'm doing that throughout this talk. I don't have a lot of text showing up at once. I'm having each point show up as I talk about it. And in Google Slides, you go up to Format, click Slide Transitions, and that's where you can set the appearance of different materials. Limit the points you make per slide so you're not asking too much of people to remember. Now, I've already kind of stressed the importance of visuals. What you do physically with your body is also an important visual component of presentation. And part of that is about dressing in a way that conveys yourself professionally and maximizes your credibility to your audience. Uh, a good rule of thumb on that is to dress in a way that you think is going to match the way your audience members are dressing, or a little bit neater and cleaner than they would dress. If you're wearing sloppy clothes, or something that really emphasizes your individuality, that's actually going to distract people from the content of what you present. When I present, oftentimes I'll wear a little sport coat and a button-up shirt, which makes me look professional, but generally just keeps people focused on what I'm saying instead of what I'm wearing. So that's actually how you dress is actually really, really important. And you know, I should say that as Oberlin students, obviously the way you dress in your daily lives is sort of an expression of your individuality and all of that. And that's wonderful. It's great that you're doing that. Um, that's not necessarily how you want to dress when you're presenting to an audience. You want to dress in a way that's going to be most effective in allowing them to hear what you say, believe that you're a credible source, trust you in what you're saying, and respect your audience. So all of those things are conveyed by what you put on yourself, how you put yourself together. Making eye contact with people, smiling at people, that means a lot. In the presentations we're going to do, um, people don't need to know the information we're presenting to them. We want them to sort of find it a pleasurable experience, and they're going to find it more pleasurable if you're smiling, conveying enthusiasm, showing conviction in what you're doing. And part of this is about preparation. If you prepare your talk well enough, you'll be able to actually enjoy presenting, and that'll help you convey your own pleasure and allow them to experience greater pleasure in your presentation as well. Um, Now, you're giving group presentations, and so that means you need to think about what the information you're conveying when you yourself are not the person presenting. And in general, you want to be directing your attention quietly towards the person who's presenting or towards the screen that's being presented. But you do want to think about not distracting, but focusing people's attention on whoever happens to be presenting at that moment. And in general, you want to be body aware, consider your posture, and minimize repetitive motions. This is actually particularly challenging for inexperienced presenters, because you'll have a tendency, because you're nervous, to be tapping your foot or doing some sort of repetitive motion that is maybe at some level calming to you, but it's distracting to the audience. So you really want to think carefully about your body movements and not allow them to distract people from the information you're conveying. So talk dynamics. This is, again, particularly important in the context of a group. And I actually think group presentations are particularly engaging. I think they're more engaging than individual presentations, but they need to be planned carefully to achieve that goal. You need to ensure that all of your members are actually being usefully engaged. They all have important parts of the presentation to give. Shifting and maintaining focus on the presenter and presentation, I've already mentioned that a little bit. The transition among group members is very, very important to an effective a group presentation, where you're kind of passing things off to different people in a way that feels natural and is well practiced, so that it's a very smooth transition between people. The other piece of this is, connecting with your audience, engaging, educating, motivating, and empowering your audience with the talk you're giving. And part of this is also about putting a positive spin on challenges. It's oftentimes the challenges involved in a project are the most interesting parts of the project, how you overcame those challenges. So try to frame everything in terms of positives and lessons learned in your talk. Achieving any of these effective communication goals for public presentations is about preparing, practicing, revising, and then practicing more. It's not possible to give a good professional presentation without practice. It simply is not possible. And the more you practice, the better your presentation is going to be. And if it's a group presentation, that does mean practicing as a group. All right, I want to talk a little bit about things not to do quickly. One is having too much text on slides. You can get away with a little bit more text with a sequential reveal where you're only asking people to look at the text you've just put up there. But you do need to be aware of not putting too much in front of people's eyes. Too much complexity on slides can be really distracting. You only want things on the slide that are helpful to communicating. Dark, busy, distracting images. Again, you want the simplest possible content that effectively conveys what you're trying to convey. Don't put stuff up that people aren't going to be able to interpret. You often see people giving presentations. I know you can't read this, but if you can't make sense out of it, you don't want to include it. Too many slides. People rushing as they come to the end of their presentation it doesn't help them convey content. So you want to time, when you practice, you want to time your talks, make sure you get them in within the limit. People do not like to see people reading a text off slide. It's boring, except when you're reading a quote or something like that, then it's quite legitimate to read off the slide. When the info on the slide does not match or reinforce what is said, people don't know, should I be looking at the slide? Should I be listening to what they're saying? So thinking about that synergy between the visuals on your slide and what people are communicating is very, very important. All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about the presentations you're going to be giving in this class, and particularly the first presentation you're going to be giving. So you've been given a template for that presentation, a set of slides, which you will copy and paste and then modify. Title slide, a slide on challenges and opportunities associated with your project, a title on desired outcomes for your project, and then the approach you're going to take in your project. As I've said before, as you think about designing these slides, think hard about empathizing with the audience we have here. They're described in the schedule for the class. They are community leaders at Oberlin College and in the larger community who are interested in environmental issues and in communication. Spend a lot of time preparing the presentation and the script. So there is a script, and I expect you to actually write a script for your talk. When you actually give your talk, whether you're delivering exactly the words in that script is not so important, but I want you to have thought about everything you're going to say and have a complete plan for every sentence you're going to say in that presentation. So yeah.